Stephanie. It is, of course, a remarkable pleasure to welcome Reverend Stephanie Perdew to share this pulpit with me on this evening. Most of you know her very well. We have been partners, First Congregational Church of Wilmette and Sukkot Shalom, for these many, many years and in many ways. For those of you who have been following this year's calendar, I have chosen during the year to look back at my own personal development in thought and in spirit as a rabbi for these 40-some years. And I've concentrated on various ways in which I have, I hope, grown and learned and developed in my thinking on various topics. But tonight, I want to especially talk about the issue of the interfaith work that I have done as a rabbi in general, but certainly especially at Sukkot Shalom. And how I think it's fair to say that it is a certain niche that I have focused on, helped define my rabbinate, and one of the topics that I go back to over and over again. I also want to talk about how that has had an impact on the interpersonal relationships that I've had as a rabbi. But I'll start, as I've done each and every month, with thinking back in terms of my academic development. I graduated from Hebrew Union College in 1980, and one of the key teachers for me during that time in Cincinnati was the late Dr. Samuel Sandmel. Dr. Sandmel was the first professor of New Testament and Christian thinking in a Jewish seminary. It didn't exist before. In fact, Jews didn't study Christianity until Abraham Geiger in the 19th century in Germany, a founder of Reform Judaism. Judaism didn't look at Christianity for its definition or for its understanding of its own development. Christians did the opposite. It would be impossible to imagine any Christian seminary not teaching Old Testament. But no Jewish seminary taught New Testament. In many ways, I think Jews thought that Christianity was contagious and dangerous and frightening. And Christianity was dependent on Judaism, but not the other way around. But I was fascinated by the topic, and I was inspired by Dr. Sandmel as a teacher. He then was followed by Dr. Michael Cook, who visited us a number of times. And as an historian, I found that time period, what's called the intertestamental time period, in between the time of the before the Common Era and the time after the Common Era, focusing basically around the time of the birth of Jesus and particularly the year 70, when the temple was destroyed. That time period in between the two testaments, the Old and New, is probably one of the most interesting periods in world history. And I was fascinated by that. I was also fascinated by studying Jesus as a Jew. Stephanie and I have traveled together, and in one of our sessions at the Mount of Beatitudes, one of our fellow clergy asked how to deal with the issue of her own kind of lack of belief. She was a Unitarian minister, if you remember. And what I said was that everything Jesus taught was Jewish. What was taught about Jesus became Christianity. And from a personal level, I can believe everything that Jesus taught. I don't personally believe what was taught about Jesus, basically by Paul. But that's the way I understood that sense of Christianity, that early time period, the time of rabbinic Judaism, and it is somewhat ironic, I don't know that this was absolutely planned this way, that we would be in this very week between approaching Easter and Passover, and a time when historically Jews were very frightened about Easter, because that's when pogroms would happen. That's when sermons coming out of the church would blame the Jews for the death of Jesus. And the irony is, it is now the time in Christian-Jewish relations when often we're closest together, when everyone wants to hear, well, what was the Last Supper? Was it a Seder or was it not a Seder? But we want to learn about all of that together. And so over time, I have found this issue of Jewish-Christian relations from a scholarly point of view, an intellectual point of view, extremely important to me and part of a core of my teaching. And with very, very good fortune and coincidence, we at Sukkot Shalom ended up in a partnership with First Congregational Church, with the late Reverend David Owens, and of course, Stephanie Perdew.
It's fair to say that just as Sam's scholarly interests had to do with New Testament, my scholarly interests had to do with what we would call Second Temple Judaism, and the way in which twin really religious movements, Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, emerged out of the fall of the temple and that fruitful and yet confusing religious time in the late first and early second centuries. For Christians, this time of year indeed is a time which was dangerous, we know, to Jewish communities, particularly in medieval Europe. After World War II, the Church Universal needed to take a fuller accounting of the way that Christian theology and tradition had been co-opted or in collusion with the ideals of the Nazi state, even though some pastors, notably Dietrich Bonhoeffer and those who signed the Barmen Declaration, dissented, sometimes at cost to their lives. The Roman Catholic Church led the way for that repentance in the time of the Second Vatican Council and issued a statement called Nostra Aetate, in our time, declaring the faith that God is a covenant maker and that God's promises are faithful because God is God and cannot break God's own promises. And that therefore God does not abdicate one covenant with the Jewish people in order to take up another, despite what the church had taught in centuries past. The United Church of Christ and other Protestant denominations followed with their own confessions of repentance and declaration to better and more fruitful interfaith dialogue. And the Jewish community responded with a statement signed by Rabbi Gordon himself, Dabru Emet. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Did perfectly.
And in the intervening years, and the scholarship that both of us have been privileged to be a part of, we have been part of a scholarly climate in which people teach New Testament at Jewish seminaries, and scholars such as Sarah Tanzer or A.J. Levine teach New Testament at Christian seminaries as Jewish scholars. We have benefited from the scholarship of many scholars who have been guests in our mutual congregations, as we have learned to read texts together in a more sophisticated way, as we have understood the archaeology of the Second Temple and post-Second Temple world, and as if we have grown in our respect for one another as brothers and sisters in parallel emergent religious traditions.
Many of you have had the opportunity to join us when we've had such scholars as Dominic Crossan and Martin Marty, Philip Culbertson, John Polakowski. I mentioned the founder of Jewish thought about Jesus being Abraham Geiger, and Susanna Heschel's book was Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus. We've had Paula Fredrickson, Amy Jill Levine, and so many others who have helped us understand those periods of time and the importance of that. But in addition to the scholarship and the intellectual aspect, we've also explored the pastoral. And this conversation of Jews and Christians happens in the seminaries, among scholars, among pastors and theologians. But for many of all of you, it happens in your living room. It is a conversation that happens within a family. It is often the conversation that I first hear when an intermarrying couple come in and the non-Jewish partner asks the Jewish partner, what do Jews believe? Or why don't Jews believe, why don't Jews believe that Jesus is divine? Or from the other side, from the Jewish point of view, not understanding what Last Supper is, what offering, the nature of the church. And in many cases, it becomes a very personal issue of how we're going to raise our kids. What are we going to have a Christmas tree? Are we going to our family for Passover or for Easter? And how do we manage this? So a lot of what takes place is the scholarly, intellectual, academic, but then it comes down to the way in which we live our lives. And the way in which we live our lives in this unique place that we are is that whether through marriage or not marriage, so many of us have conversations of diversity, families of diversity, neighborhoods of diversity, friends of diversity. And so it is that in a parallel way, Sukkot Shalom was developed out of those conversations. And sometimes we were able to blend the two. My favorite teaching opportunity, and many of you remember, was to take the story of Eden and read it from Jewish eyes and from Christian eyes. That Christian eyes read the story of Eden as sin, disobedience, fall from grace. And Jews should at least read it in the text as awareness, awakening, eyes open. What Rabbi Harold Kushner said, not paradise lost, but paradise outgrown, about full maturity, sexuality. And we share a story, and yet we read it so differently. And that also allows us to have a better understanding of each other. So, at least in my rabbinate, I've tried to weave those various aspects together, both from the scholarly, intellectual, and the pastoral, and bringing them together kind of in a synthesis using text and so forth that we can appreciate. And the partnership that has existed between Stephanie, David Owens, me, has allowed all of that to happen in a way that I think is truly unique in our country and as well as in our shared faiths.
During the time that we shared sacred space together, which began, I believe, in 1997 with High Holidays and concluded around the year 2010, we traveled together as a team to visit other congregations with space-sharing models. We went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to visit one of those places in person, and we found that just because people share space does not mean that they share ministry or service or travel or learning. And during those years that we shared space, and even after, as we learned that we could not fit all of the many things both of our congregations wanted to do in the building at 1125 Wilmette Avenue, we continued to share in travel, in study, in service, and in public witness together. And I am proud that that partnership, I pray, will continue with a new generation of clergy. We did not anticipate that I would leave the pulpit of First Congregational before Sam left this synagogue. My opportunity to do so and to work as an associate conference minister of my denomination, the Illinois Conference United Church of Christ, was a surprise to my congregation and somewhat of a surprise to me. I celebrated my final Sunday in my pulpit actually at this bima, as many of you know. And there was something deeply fitting about that. Some of you were involved in the travails regarding the First Congregational Church boiler 2 decades ago, and I'm sorry to say that they have continued. During the years of our partnership, we hosted phenomenal guest scholars together. We founded a refugee ministry together along with our friends at First Presbyterian Church. Reverend Dr. Jason Okrzyński, who is here tonight, continues that ministry as the acting head of staff at First Congregational. Rabbi Carly Daniels continues that ministry as soon-to-be acting head of staff here at the synagogue. We watched our children grow and held Bible camps for them, and we traveled and studied together. A capstone of my ministry, though I didn't know it at the time, was our fall 2018 group congregational trip to Israel and the West Bank. Even to undertake a journey such as that demanded that we have conversations about what it meant to go to one another's holy sites, to understand what pilgrimage means for Christians and what traveling to the state of Israel means for Jews. We worshiped, we prayed, we laughed, we ate a phenomenal amount of delicious food. And on the day that we entered Jerusalem, we began at the Mount of Olives. We progressed to Shabbat at the Western Wall. When that week was ended, or that Shabbat, was ended, we celebrated Havdalah and Holy Communion, not in a syncretistic way, but each rite for its own faithful, on the rooftop of the World Center for Reform Judaism. Is
World
that where we
Union,
were?
yeah, and Hebrew Union College.
And Hebrew Union College. And it was there during that celebration that our phones went off, and we learned of the tragedy at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Here at home, Rabbi Carly and Cantor Kinney and Reverend Hogue, who was on our staff at the time, joined in a commemoration here. We had our own memorial commemoration the next day on Masada. I am personally thankful for this interfaith ministry, which continues to enrich my life, and I'm thankful that so many founding families and people I go way back with are in the house tonight, not just at home, but in the synagogue. My work with Interfaith Dialogue continues. Because of these relationships, I was asked to be one of 2 Christian co-chairs for the Jewish Federation of Chicago's Interfaith Dialogue for Women Religious Leaders, in which those of us who are now at a seasoned point in our career have invited very young new clergy women from both faith traditions into a time of learning and dialogue together. I took leave of my congregation, as you know, in January, but thankfully I did not have to leave my synagogue. And it is a privilege to be with you tonight. It will be a privilege to be with you in May. I hear that my friend Jill will be here. It has been a blessing of my ministry to be a pastor to you and to have my very own rabbi who will continue as my very dear friend.
I think that what has happened over these years has been transformative. Transformative in terms of our community, but also transformative in terms of who we are as people. I've taken many trips to Israel, but this was the first time I ever visited the Holy Land.
Fair enough.
Because visiting with Christian eyes, we saw something in a very different kind of way. Whether it was personal baptism at the Jordan River, or as you say, our Havdalah that we shared together and communion. And that walk from the top of the Mount of Olives down to Gethsemane, and then to the Western Wall, and to realize that we were walking on these ancient stones, back to that intertestamental time period, back to that time of 70, back to the time when Jesus and Hillel walked those streets, and that we were walking them together. And we were walking them with a sense of respect and honor and true and deep love for each other. It is my hope that the model that was created with First Congregational Church and with Sukkot Shalom is a model that will continue, and it will be looked to by others as a lesson in how two communities can be distinctive and authentic in and of themselves, but to learn from each other, to grow with each other, and to respect and support each other. This has also been one of my great privileges. Shabbat Shalom.